Senator James Paterson is the chair of the Federal Parliament's Powerful Intelligence and Security Committee. He joins me now in the studio. Senator Paterson, welcome.
Thank you. And look, I'll give a solemn pledge, unlike your previous guest, not to disrobe in any way.
OK, I'm really glad about that, actually. Let's start with the National Cabinet update. Obviously, there is a change to the way that the vaccine is being rolled out. But just on this decision around India, a 30% reduction in flights, doesn't that risk leaving some Australians stranded, people desperate to get home from India?
Look, for that reason, Patricia, this is an unfortunate and regrettable decision, and I doubt it was one that the National Cabinet took with much relish at all. But I think it is a pragmatic one to balance the risk that it would pose to Australians of bringing back people from what is now clearly a very high-risk jurisdiction. It's very sad in many ways because India was doing quite well in holding back COVID and remarkably successful in both manufacturing vaccines but actually being willing to export them around the world despite their own challenges, which I think is a great credit to them, in contrast to other jurisdictions who kept those vaccines onshore. But they are now dealing with a very serious problem, and we have to make the appropriate adjustments to our program.
But it is a pretty serious change to the way we have treated countries to actually have now a system where we refer to high-risk countries. Do you think that's a right approach now as we go into sort of the second year of this pandemic?
It mirrors the decisions that Australia made a year ago to initially ban travellers from China and then South Korea and then Iran and then ultimately the whole world. And when we did so, we were leading the world in those decisions, and I think most Australians would look back at that and be glad that we did. I think it's one of the reasons we've had the success that we had. It was based then on solid medical advice, as this decision is today. Not something that we're going to be celebrating. It's certainly regrettable, but I think it is necessary to protect Australians.
Let's move on to some other issues. China's embassy in Australia has said that this move to ban the Belt and Road Initiative shows that the Morrison government does not wish to improve relations between the two nations, that it's provocative. Is it provocative? Is this about provoking China?
Well, by contrast, I think what it shows is that the Morrison government wants to be in charge of our foreign relations, whether that's with China or any other country. And we take a very reasonable position that almost any other government in the world, including the government of China, would take, which is that the federal government in Canberra should determine our national interest and our foreign policy, not any state or territory, or let alone any other smaller entities. And so I'm surprised that the Chinese government is objecting to that. I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing for Australia or any other country to do.
OK, but do you expect an economic retaliation? We've seen trade sanctions. Last year it really was a theme that we felt we were very much being punished by China. Do you anticipate that that will happen now?
Yes, that is possible. Certainly the Chinese government has shown a propensity to do that in the past. I think it's been proven already, though, to be an unsuccessful strategy in two important respects. One is it hasn't produced the change in policy that the Chinese government has demanded of us. We have not backed down in any way, and if anything, it has hardened our resolve and made the bipartisan resolve even stronger. But secondly, the economic effects have not probably been what the Chinese government would intended. Most of the costs have been borne by Chinese consumers. Most of the industries singled out for sanction have found other markets. Wine is an exception to that, but most others have. And in fact, even our trade with China is relatively stable because of the increase in iron ore prices. So really the only people that have lost from this is the Chinese people, and that's very unfortunate, but it's a decision for their government.
OK, but you say that you still think it's a very much a live thing that may happen, and we should just be prepared to...
Unfortunately, I think it is a possibility, and I do worry about those industries not yet targeted who may be targeted, but what they can have confidence in is that they'll have support to diversify and reduce their exposure to China, which I think is a sensible thing for us all to do.
I suppose if they do suffer an economic consequence, and it hasn't been announced yet, it may be in coming days or hours, who knows. But the Belt and Road Initiative was largely symbolic, wasn't it? Is it worth it?
I think it is often symbolic, but it does have some concrete effects too. It is harmful in a symbolic sense that inherently I think it's damaging for a subnational entity to take a position on foreign affairs which is contrary to the national government's position, particularly because it's a bipartisan federal government position from the Labor and Liberal Party alike. So I think that was inherently harmful. But I think it also undermined our position in the region, undermined our strategic security, and that's why it was important for both practical and symbolic reasons for it to be rescinded.
And to sort of decode that for our viewers who aren't across sort of foreign relations, you're saying, you know, in our region, we've been saying to small Pacific nations, don't sign up to this, but we've got to sort of jurisdiction that has?
We've been think very carefully about it, look at the fine details and make sure that it's in your national interest. My judgment would be that it's often not in the national interest of the countries that end up being recipients of it. It comes at a very high cost, and often a cost that's not stated up front by the Chinese government. But unfortunately, you're right. In Australians giving that word of caution to our Pacific friends and family, Chinese diplomats equally would have been able to turn around and say, well, the Australian government doesn't participate, but the Victorian government does, so how bad could it be? And that way, I hope unknowingly, but certainly in reality, the Andrews government has undermined our national security in the region, and I'm glad that Enola can do so.
When the federal government, the Morrison government, first announced this new legislation, this new approach to being able to cancel these kinds of deals, the Andrews government didn't seem too happy. Today, I feel like there's been a shift. There hasn't been a lot of outrage from the Andrews government. They've sort of moved on quite quickly. Has there been a change in approach?
I think it was a more muted response than the one that they gave previously, and appropriately they've recognised that foreign policy is a matter for the federal government. I think that's an important concession on their part. It's not something that they previously conceded, so I welcome that, and I hope that reflects a new attitude from the Andrews government, that it will focus on what it is good at and what state governments specialise in, and we encourage them to do that, and we'll focus on what's our responsibility.
Look, just before I let you go, I started with the National Cabinet. I'm kind of ending with it, but really more specifically on vaccines. There's been a rise in vaccine hesitancy. There's no doubt about it, AstraZeneca particularly, but I think more broadly. You're under 50, I know you are. I am too, thank you very much. But us under 50s, would you get the AstraZeneca jab?
I'll get whatever vaccine I'm eligible for at the time I become eligible for it, and if that's AstraZeneca, yes, I would happily take it. Based on my understanding of the risks, I think the risks are low and worthwhile to allow myself to be protected against COVID-19 and to allow our country to return as much as possible to the normal world that we had before the virus. It won't be completely returned to normal and it won't be overnight, but it won't happen unless we get reasonably high rates of take-up of the vaccine, and that's why I share your concern about that hesitancy.
It is a worry. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.